I want to call the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization's UPWP committee meeting to order. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. Participants can mute and unmute themselves. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking either on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with the raised hand button at the bottom or the reactions button in the toolbar. The chair will then call on participants. If you're on the phone, you can use the *9 to raise your hand. And if you have any technical difficulties, please contact Matt Archer via the chat box or marcher@ctps.org, or you can call him at 857-702-3708. This meeting is being recorded. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exception with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. Again, if you require additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Matt Archer, MPO staff at marcher@ctps.org or 857-702-3708. So I'm Eric Barassa with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and we are going to do a roll call now. Matt, do you want to do that, or do you want me to call people out?
The chair has traditionally done it, if you don't mind.
Sure. Okay. Derek Schuster.
Here.
Daniel Amstutz.
Daniel Amstutz, Town of Arlington, here.
Thank you. Jim Fitzgerald. Bill Conroy. Erica Jarama.
Erica Jerem, representing
Oh, I'm
Metro
sorry,
West
Erica.
Growth. It's okay.
No,
You're not the first or the last. Representing Metro West Growth Collaborative and City of Framingham.
Okay. I assume Eric's not here. Peter Pelletier. David Kosis.
I'm David Kosis, representing Mayor Fuller here.
Tom O'Rourke.
Good morning, Tom O'Rourke at the town of Norwood, representing the Trick subregion.
Tom Bent.
Tom Bent, representing City of Somerville and Mayor Joe Curtatone.
Len Diggins.
Leonard Diggins, representing the Advisory Council.
Great. I think.
Eric, I think we just let in Jen Rowe from BTD. And I don't know, I assume she's standing in for Bill Conroy.
Jen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Jen Rowe, and yes, I am standing in for Bill Conroy today.
Great. Okay, so let me go back. So the first thing on the agenda is public comments. Are there any members of the public that would like to make a public comment? I'm not seeing any. So our first action item is a summary of the October 21st meetings. Sandy, did you want to give a summary of that, or are we just looking for a motion?
Really just looking for a motion. I would like to thank Matt Archer for putting the summary together, as he's done it for the last several.
Great. Daniel?
I have a correction on. So number 4, or item 4 on the minutes, and item 5 on the minutes have the same title. Action item amendment 1 to the FFY 2022 UPWP. I think number 5 is supposed to be a different title. So that should just be corrected. I think the item 5 was about sub-regional outreach and other outreach activities.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, we'll correct that. Sorry for not catching that.
That's fine. I'll, unless anyone else wants to say anything, happy to make a motion to approve as
Great.
amended.
Can I have a second?
I'll second that.
Great. So we will do a quick roll call. Let's see. Derek Schuster.
Aye.
Daniel Amstutz.
Yes.
Len Diggins.
Yes.
Jen Rowe.
Yes.
Tom Bent.
Yes.
Tom O'Rourke.
Yes.
Erica Jerem.
Yes.
David Kosis.
Yes. Yes, did you hear me? Yes.
Yes. Okay, that motion passes. Thank you all. The next item is the Amendment 1 to the FFY 2022 UPWP. Sandy.
All right, so today we're asking for you to make a motion and to recommend to the NPO that they endorse this amendment at the following meeting, the 10 o'clock meeting. The committee and the NPO voted to release this amendment for a 21-day public comment period on October 21st. That public comment period then ran through November 10th, and we received no public comments on this amendment. So I'm just going to kind of recap the amendment briefly so to refresh everybody's mind about what it's about, and then ask for a motion to recommend to the NPO. So Matt, if we could go to the next slide. The amendment extends $45,000 in unused FFY 2021 combined 3C funds for two major purposes related to the NPOs and CTPS's strategic goals. There's $20,000 that'll be used for new skill development early in this fiscal year with a focus on preparing staff to implement a new suite of modeling tools. There's a light load of non-NPO funded project work at the beginning of FFY 2022, which is creating some staff availability and presenting an opportunity to use these funds. There's also $25,000 that'll be transferred from labor and overhead to direct cost, and those funds will be used to procure support from Caliper, which is the company that develops the travel demand models and software that we use, TransCAD. And that support will provide a one-time opportunity to accelerate development of the next phase of travel demand modeling tools. So overall, the amendment will increase the 22 UPWP budget by $45,000 because the funds being used are extended 2021 funds. There's no negative impact to work programmed in the 22 UPWP. The amendment also makes several minor typo corrections and textual corrections, such as inserting project ID numbers where they had previously been left TBD. There's several materials to support the amendment on the calendar, as you probably remember from the last meeting, short memo explaining the reasoning and process, an updated version of the 22 UPWP as it would be when this amendment is endorsed, and a marked up version of the 22 UPWP showing where changes have been made. So I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. And if not, if you don't have any, then would request that you recommend that the NPO endorse this.
Thank you, Sandy. Any questions for Sandy or staff? Okay, not seeing any. Can I have a motion to endorse? Derek Schuster?
Derek Schuster, motion to endorse.
Can I get a second?
I'll second.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, we will call the roll. Derek Schuster.
Eric, I would just
Yeah.
point out that I think Bill Conroy just joined us.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay,
Yes, thank you. Sorry I'm late.
that's fine, Bill. You'll be voting for the city of Boston.
Thank you.
Derek Schuster,
Yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Yes.
Len Diggins,
Yes.
Bill Conroy,
Yes,
Tom Bent,
Yes.
Tom O'Rourke,
Yes.
Erica Jerem,
Yes.
and David Kosis.
Yes.
Great. That amendment passes. Thank you all. Let's see, what is the next thing on the agenda? Tools to analyze congestion pricing in NPO planning. Oh, I'm excited for this. Sandy, who's presenting on this?
I think Tegan's going to give an intro, and then Marty will do most of the talking for this presentation.
Great.
Thanks, Sandy. Thanks, Eric. So Eric, I had intended to give a little bit of a context-setting intro, just because this conversation obviously has a long string through many meetings, and so I wanted to remind us sort of where we are today, and refer back to the tone we set at the July meeting where we discussed this last. And so for those who were not there at the meeting, and for those of us who are, but I always find a reminder helpful, on that July 1st meeting, we staff came to this committee recommending a more final discrete study list of projects And earlier on, there had been a congestion pricing study included in that list, and staff brought a recommendation, which was then pretty extensively discussed, that no longer included the congestion pricing study as its own standalone discrete study item, primarily due to budget constraints, as well as feedback from our Mass DOT partners on kind of the timing and the usefulness of the outcomes of the proposed study. So while the committee then voted unanimously to send forward those recommendations, there was a lot of discussion, and some board members had wanted to commit to a discrete study in the next UPWP around congestion pricing. So sort of saying in advance that there was a commitment to fund. And we also, staff and also others on the committee, talked about how congestion pricing and looking at how it could be analyzed could actually be folded into the overall scenario planning process that we are planning for the long range transportation plan, and that some of that work could fit within that existing long range transportation plan budget. And at the time, the chair, I think it was Ben Mueller serving as the chair at that time, suggested stating more explicitly how the LRTP process could incorporate congestion pricing. So to resolve the conversation that day, we offered to come back and share how we are looking at the ability to advance congestion pricing through the LRTP congestion scenario planning work. So today, we are here, and the timing is important. We are really kind of at the point of launching, thinking about scenarios and scenario planning. And we are at a point where, unlike, say, a year ago, we know that congestion is largely back, right, from the pre-COVID levels, and in some cases worse. So today, what we are coming here to do is to talk to you about how we can use the travel demand modeling and other tools that we have to look at and understand better congestion pricing in a scenario, in a long range scenario planning process. So this conversation is just laying the groundwork for what technically may or may not be feasible. We have not yet at this time committed to or selected any specific scenarios. So this is kind of this advanced work to let you know what the pros and cons might be of trying to use our tools to assess this topic. So I hope you will forgive me providing all of those nuances, but I want to make sure we're very clear where we are in this conversation and what Marty is here to talk to you about. And we plan to have a workshop with the board members, all of you, if you're interested, in December. And that workshop will be around the next steps of that big ideas work that we recently presented. And that will start to be the genesis of formulating what our scenarios might look like in our scenario planning process. So I'd be happy to answer any questions if that's not clear, but I wanted to set up Marty for the right context as he's coming into this conversation.
I think that sounds great. I think we can pass it on to Marty. Thank you, Tegan.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Tegan. So as Tegan, I think, laid out very well, the major purpose of this presentation is to build that understanding of our current capabilities, or the capabilities that we'll have with our next generation travel demand model. That part of that UPWP amendment is meant to help us accelerate the development around, but also to see where there might be limitations in how we can analyze quantitatively different congestion pricing strategies. So another effort that we'll be engaging in next year is developing a longer-term modeling roadmap where we identify new types of tools that we want to bring on board. So I kind of view this as an early step in that longer-term process as well. So the way we're going to approach it today is I'm going to start off giving you very high level, broad picture of what's the spectrum of analysis tools when we talk about it. There's no such thing as that Swiss Army tool that can do everything, or if there is, it's basically unusable. It's too big, you can't wield it. So I'm going to talk about the spectrum and use that as context to identify where our current travel demand model exists, which is a trip-based model. So I'll spend a little bit of time giving you some background on what trip-based models, what they are, how they work. It will be brief, and I'll keep it at a very accessible level, I hope. And then with that, we're going to talk about 3 example strategies of how congestion pricing could be implemented. Starting off with some kind of parking pricing or capacity limitation, a toll that's implemented in a cordon around an area, And then a type of toll that would be implemented on, say, a managed lane that could be implemented like a dynamic toll responsive to the congestion on the managed lane versus the general purpose lane. So we'll walk through each of those examples and use them to kind of highlight, here's what we get out of the model, and here's what we actually might be lacking. So with that, Matt, we can go ahead and get started. So you might have seen this slide before. This is my generic, this is what makes up a model or analysis tool. So I'll go through it relatively quickly here. But essentially, every analysis tool requires a set of inputs, representation of the scenario, and along with those inputs are our theory or assumptions, which essentially define how those inputs would be related. So this is often realized on some type of modeling platform, anything from Excel to Transcad to other, specific purpose-built platforms. And through that interaction, we get some types of results. And so that is kind of the model, in a nutshell. But to be really useful, it has to have this interaction with the stakeholder. And that's the most important aspect of it. The stakeholder approaches a model with a series of needs, a series of questions, decisions that need to be supported. And if the model is useful, it provides insights back to that stakeholder that help them make a better decision, get more insight into the question that they're asking. So that is the real goal of modeling. And we can kind of keep this framework in mind when we think about what we want to represent. And we should always be thinking about it from the terms of the stakeholder. There's always things that the model cannot capture, because if it captured everything, it would be the real world. It would be way too big to be able to use effectively. So we're going to drive it from the needs. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about the broad spectrum of transportation analysis tools. So these are organized from sort of the most detailed to the kind of highest level. So the trade-off here, the more detailed, often the more information you need, the more inputs that need to be specified. So that is more work. And if you're maybe wanting to test a broad range of different strategies, you don't want to necessarily spend so much time being very specific about how each one works, because that's not the question you're trying to answer at that time. So then from operational, so an example of that is like a micro simulation model. Actually, you see individual vehicles represented in the computer simulation. And then there's what we call the demand level. So this is where we're operating with our travel demand model. So this is something that's really estimating what is the demand for travel, and then it routes it on abstract representations of our roadways and our transit system. So these are often referred to as either trip-based or activity-based. Those are the two major paradigms of demand models in practice today. Next up is strategic. So strategic models, Vision Eval is an example of a model that FHWA supports through a pooled fund program. It's open source. MAPC actually recently implemented a version of Vision Eval and used it as part of their Metropolitan analysis. So this is strategic in that it's abstracting a bit more from the demand level, in that it doesn't have an explicit representation of the roads or transit. It takes it as a more abstract input. Above that is a sketch. So sketch models are things where you have a rate, you have an elasticity, you apply it to your inputs, and you get some kind of output. But it doesn't necessarily have as much interaction as those other level models. And then finally, the highest level of model is a qualitative model, meaning we don't necessarily have math or formulas inside of it, but it's something where we use it to kind of understand how things are working. Often the outputs of all of these other models are put within a qualitative context in order to actually, communicate those insights from the model to stakeholders. So with that, let's go a little bit deeper into what makes up a trip-based model. So I'm going to start by talking about the inputs aspect of it. Then I'll talk about the assumptions. So the inputs I'll categorize into how we represent, sort of space in the model, and the next how we represent our roadway and transit networks in the model. So first, space, we use what are called TAZs, or transportation analysis zones. And so you see all these boxes that are drawn. This is kind of North and West Cambridge. I'm in Porter Square, so I thought that would be an appropriate example. And what you see, drawn, this is essentially what the model is doing, is saying for this block of space in the world, I'm going to represent that all together. And the data associated with it, in a sense, the model treats it as like it's all the same. I can almost put it on a single point which is what the model needs in order to be able to work with it. So what gets loaded into the TAZ? Any kind of categorical attributes of what type of zone is this? Is this a dense area? Is this a suburban area? All of our socioeconomic inputs are realized at the TAZ level. So how many households, what type they are, types of jobs, school enrollment levels. We also can use this to kind of set trips directly and say, like, the airport is going to have this number of people who are going to be either going to board a plane or just landed and are alighting and leaving the airport. So something that's not necessarily generated from a household or generated from an employment center, but these are the trips outside the model. And then what's most important for us, for our discussion today, is this is where we would actually capture parking cost. So the point I want to really make here is you can see these zones, some of them can be fairly large depending on the density of what we're representing. They may have multiple parking areas within that zone, some that are free, some that are paid, some that are only employer provided, but we need to represent that for the entire zone. So essentially, we're going to abstract up all of that into a single value. So you can see how we do start, this is where we're starting to abstract the representation of the real world. So the next slide shows how we represent our networks. So the term we use for networks are nodes, which are points, and links, which connect the nodes together. And by following a series of links, you can navigate or traverse the network. So what's shown on the left is the representation of the roadways. So what's highlighted in blue are all the roadways. So you can see not all roadways in the real world are represented in the network. And that's necessary because we're using this to evaluate vehicle demand, vehicle volumes, and how they're traveling. If we represent every little local street, for one thing, that's a lot of effort to develop it, right? So we're going to be constrained by that. And the model products that we have, they don't behave very well when they have every road represented. Of course, in denser areas like downtown Boston, we actually get pretty close to every single road represented, but it becomes sort of a call of the modeler of whether something is an important roadway or just something that's there to access, a certain set of houses or employment within a zone, which, as we know, are represented, in a uniform way at that TAZ level. On the right is actually the transit. So transit are different routes that are essentially drawn on top of the roadways. We also have specific transit links. So actually it's highlighted there in the alternating colors. That's the red line. So Alewife is at the top left corner. It kind of goes off the page to hit Davis, and then goes down through Porter and Harvard in the bottom right. So, and that is how we represent our road and transit, is all through this network. So with the next thing is I want to talk about how we take those and then apply our assumptions. And so I thought what would be helpful is to essentially say, what is the question that the model is answering as it goes through each of the steps? So on the left in those big boxes, that's the name of the model step. First we have an input or initialization step. We kind of get everything set up. And on the right, this is the question that the model is essentially answering at that level. And this model is a sequential model, meaning the vehicle availability at the second step, when we answer the question of how many vehicles are available in your household, we've answered that question just after knowing where do you live and who are you, meaning what's your income, how big is your household, are there children, are there workers, that sort of thing. Then we say, okay, how many vehicles are in your household? Now you might say at this point, well, actually, when I got a different job that I couldn't use the T to get to, I bought a vehicle. And so really, I want to answer that. I didn't answer that question until after I had a job. That's true, but that's not how we've organized the model, because the model is an abstraction of how things work. These are part of our assumptions, is that this is the order of decisions. So we answer the first question, who are you, where do you live? Great. Then we say how many vehicles. Then from that, we're actually going to build this new component. And there's another initiative to help explore this, but about asking how much does each worker go to the office? Obviously, remote work is a big question now that we want the model to be useful in answering. Next step, we say, okay, well, given all that other information of who are you, where you live, how many vehicles, how often do people go to the office, how many trips does your household make? So think of how many times are people in your household leaving the house to go somewhere else. And with that information, we next ask, okay, where do they go? And the model answers that question. Where are those trips going when they leave your household or between different locations outside of the home? With this information, we can then answer the question of how do you get there, or the mode choice. So are you traveling alone in a car? Are you sharing that car with others? Are you going by transit? Are you walking to transit? Are you driving to transit or being dropped off by a car to transit? Are you using some kind of ride sourcing support like Uber or Lyft? Are you just walking the whole way, or are you biking the whole way? So that's where the model answers that question. Then with that, we'll say, okay, what specific time of day will you be traveling in, given all of this information? And then finally, we get to the part where we put it onto that network that we saw before. And so now we're essentially answering the question of what route do you take on this trip? How will you actually navigate from your origin to your destination, either by a vehicle or by transit? So with this, I'm going to use this same framework to talk about those 3 congestion pricing strategies. And I want to highlight where they have an impact and what kind of information, what kind of questions we can answer from those strategies. We go to the next slide, Matt. So starting off with parking pricing. I apologize for all the words on this slide. First, let me orient you. We see the stack of boxes on the right. Those are that same stack of the model steps. And I've highlighted in orange where parking pricing would have some kind of an impact. Either we're setting it in the input because we're setting it at the TAZ. It's going to have an impact for trip distribution. In other words, based on the parking pricing, we may answer that question of where do those trips go from a household differently. They will be sensitive to the pricing level of parking at the destination end of the trip. Similarly, for mode choice, some modes will have a parking impact if it's a private vehicle versus if it's ride sourcing or transit or walking and biking, obviously no parking cost necessary there. So it's also going to have an impact in mode choice. And finally, because we have changed mode choice, we've changed the answer to that question, how do you get there and where do you go? We expect some changes in the routes because actually our trips are different now. We have different numbers and distributions of vehicle trips. So when we actually route them on our roadway network, we will see different traffic volumes and congestion. So I'm just highlighting this. So what I just talked through is essentially what's here listed in the words about what are the types of questions that we can ask a model with this representation of parking pricing where you put it in at the TAZ level. Len, I'm just going to go through this quick and then I want to go to your question. So we can ask the model, how much would mode share change or travel demand change by trip purpose and zone, given that we have set some kind of parking pricing into the model? We can also ask, okay, so with that response of people changing modes or changing their destination, how has congestion changed? Where is it moved somewhere else? Is the intensity changed where it was before? And finally, we can look at the home end and say, how many trips changed from different home locations based on this this parking pricing. And so this is how we do a lot of our equity analysis, actually looking at travel from zones that are identified with an equity population and saying how much are they affected by this different strategy. Lynn, I'll go to you now before I talk about the limitations.
Yeah, no problem. I appreciate that. I mean, so yeah, that's totally fine. So I was just curious about why time of day isn't indicated, because sometimes people do, or locations do vary their pricing by time of day.
That's an excellent question. And so the reason the time of day is not highlighted here, because the way the time of day is represented in our model is it's not sensitive to things like, oh, if in this travel time period the parking is more expensive, so we will not have as many trips in that time period. Now, if we had something like parking, parking for peak trips, so travel in the morning, they're going to pay a higher parking price than travel in the midday or the night. We could represent that in the model, but what we wouldn't see necessarily is someone changing, you know what, it's expensive to drive and park in the morning, I'm going to go midday and avoid that high parking fee. That's not something that this model is capable of.
Thank you.
No, that's it. I'm glad you highlighted it. I should have that in the limitations.
Thanks.
Daniel?
Oh, thank you. I was going to wait until a little bit later, but since you let Len ask a question, just on the briefly on the last slide,
Yeah.
when it comes to trip assignment, are trails or shared use paths represented in the network when it comes to like how you assign where, like if people are obviously not driving, you know, they would use the Minuteman Bikeway, for example, in Arlington, that gets quite a lot of use. So is that somehow represented?
So the model does not assign non-vehicle, non-transit trips. So if it's a walk or a bike trip or that component of it, we're not saying we don't estimate in the model how that trip is routed. What we do estimate is if you when you're making your mode choice of should, you know, how do I get there? Should I walk? Should I bike? Should I use a car? The bike paths and all of the local streets, those will be represented in the next generation model. So actually what I showed in that, you know, net representation of the network, and I'm glad you're asking this, that shows, that's for the vehicles, and that picture of like, if you're driving, how do you get there? And that's going to be used to how long does it take? How much congestion do you run into? For walking and biking, what we're developing now is a full representation of the network, such that we capture that there might be a new bike path that actually is a lot more efficient. You know, it's a much more direct way to connect two areas. This is going to be really useful when, you know, pedestrian bridges are built, say over at Alewife, over the commuter rail tracks, or connecting Assembly to the casino in Everett. But the area of modeling, and this is something that I'm excited about exploring more, but the tools are slightly different, and that's really understanding the response of walking and biking facilities. So what's the difference in a cycle track versus a bike lane versus sharrows, as far, you know, as attracting and making, you know, biking a better experience? That's something that it's not going to be terribly well represented in the travel demand model. There are more purpose-built models for biking in that way, because it gets to the level of detail that you know, information about lights, about turns, you know, protected areas becomes a lot more critical.
Cool, thank you very much.
Welcome. So to come back to the limitations I want to highlight here, is, as I mentioned earlier, when we think about the parking cost in or availability in a zone, we abstract it to one level and then we provide it sort of to all trips. So what we can't distinguish is, you know, when I travel to my workplace, there's no parking available, but someone who, you know, works in the next building, they actually have parking for their employees. We're not representing that in the model. So essentially we just have to say, me and the next person are both paying the same amount for those trips and will respond with the same level of sensitivity. The value of time also is not highly distinguished in the model. So while we do have a different, so value of time here is essentially what's the trade-off? So I have to pay, you know, $10 in parking. How much time is that equivalent to saving? Let's say, you know, transit takes 30 minutes longer, but it saves me $10. You know, so if I take that bet, then okay, I have a value of time of less than $20 an hour. I mean, maybe some days I do, depending on how important it is. Some days I don't. Certainly different people have different thresholds for that, as well as, you know, for different, we do have that by different purpose. So my work trip versus social recreation trip, but there's not as much granularity across travelers. And then finally, the parking, the way trips are represented, we don't distinguish that you may park, say, several blocks away to save some money relative to where your final destination is. We're not sort of representing that ability that people have to go to park a little further away, save some money, and then walk that part of the trip. Again, that's a trade-off that requires a lot more information and can be very specific to the area. But we can answer, I probably should say the limitations first, so I end on a high note. There's a lot of questions we can answer with this model around parking pricing. Let me go to the next one and talk about the cordon toll. So here we're going to represent the congestion strategy on our network. So we're going to take links of the network, and we'll take the links that make up the whole cordon, and every link we will set a toll value, such that any trip that wants to use that link has to pay a toll, and then that is conveyed back to our distribution model. Where are those trips going? Well, I know if I go to that zone, I have to cross the cordon. I have that toll. It affects the mode choice. If I use a private auto or a ride sourcing, I have to pay the toll to go through there. I wouldn't have to pay it if I use transit modes or walking or biking modes. And again, this will then affect our assignment because we'll have a different set of trips that we'll be assigning or routing onto our networks. So the questions we can answer are actually pretty much the same thing that we can answer in the parking pricing, and the limitations are similar. One exception I should, or with a couple of exceptions. One thing is I want to emphasize we need to define into the model, where is this cordon? What are the levels of the cordon? Like how much should be charged? That's where a model can help us get some insight into, but we can't just ask the model, tell us where to draw the cordon. Where are the trips happening that would be most efficient? So there's definitely some work there interacting with the model in order to define that. Again, the value of time is a challenge. The other point I want to make is my understanding of some of the cordon toll is essentially, you pay it for the day. So if I cross the cordon in the morning, I can cross as many times as I want for the rest of the day. I've paid my fare. Because we're representing everything at a trip level, we can't capture that. So it might be, that you always go to this restaurant when you go, downtown, when you cross the cordon, because hey, it's okay. Where I would never go separately. The model can't capture that subtlety in the behavior. So you might say, this is actually going to produce a more conservative estimate of how people will respond to the toll. In other words, that they'll respond at a greater level because every trip experiences the toll. And again, the time of day, that response of like, oh, is a higher toll in the morning, I'll shift my trip till after 10 a.m. when the toll goes down. We'll see, instead, we would just see, I'll shift my destination or I'll shift my mode in the model. So again, kind of a more conservative picture of the response. So now, let's go to the last grade. So now the managed lane. So this is, again, represented at the link level, but here what we would do, and I'm not sure if you can make it out on that little image, but essentially what we're going to do is draw another link next to the existing set of links. So this is an example of how it was implemented for the Tobin Bridge managed lane analysis. And what this lets the model do is, as it's doing the routing, if that managed lane link, even though you're paying the toll, is actually that much faster, it will start to put trips over onto that managed lane. And then when we take the picture of how long does it take you to get from zone A to zone B, that if that managed lane does provide enough of a speed up for the toll, then we'll see some improvement there. So similar set of questions we can answer with this kind of representation. Now the limitations here, I want to highlight operational issues become pretty important when you're talking about managed lanes. Things like queuing and spillback, if we're actually taking a lane, that becomes pretty critical to whether or not this is going to operate well. In this representation at the demand level, we're not going to be able to capture that. So for the Tobin Bridge example, there's an analysis with a consultant who's actually implementing it in a micro simulation model. So we're using a mix of models across the spectrum to do that full analysis. The other consideration here is if you want to, to really see the picture and response of a dynamic toll, the way we represent times of day in a travel demand model is much broader than a sort of minute-to-minute update of toll values. Similar to the value of time that we talked about earlier, that, will I pay the toll, will I not pay the toll choice is not going to be represented in this picture of the model. It's basically assume everyone has a similar response to that. The other thing I want to highlight, one of the advantages of a managed lane is the reliability. So it might not just be, oh, I'll save 5 minutes, but it's that I'm going to shrink the potential delay that I might experience by using that managed lane. So I'm almost paying for the guarantee of my travel time. That's something that, again, this model platform, a demand model platform, will not be able to give us a lot of good insight around, besides just saying, here's the level of congestion, and we'd have to extrapolate from that to what's the range of reliability of potential delays in different situations. Okay, I believe that's all the material. It's all the material I prepared for our discussion, but I'm happy to take any further questions.
Other questions for Marty? Len?
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Marty. So I feel as if I'm missing something about the time of day, especially with respect to the coordinate pricing, because it seems to me if we can't capture time of day, then we can't capture any benefits from congestion pricing. Because it seems like to me like one of the goals of congestion pricing is to kind of spread out the usage of the roadways so that you don't have intense congestion in the morning rush or whatever, and you can use the roadways when they have less use.
It's a great critique of this model platform, is that it doesn't have the shifting in time of day. So part of the challenge here is, just to give you a little more information about how it's represented, is we have we break the day, actually, as you know now from our discussion in the steering committee, we break the day into 4 time periods. So we use pretty big blocks of time. The AM peak is 3 hours. We're planning to extend the PM peak to 4 hours. So essentially we're going to say, just like we do with space, right? We're going to aggregate the time together and say, the experience is consistent within this block of time. We're going to average it across. So it's like we're aggregating together. So, a lot of the shift might be within that same time period, right? Like I'll go a little earlier, go a little later to avoid that peak of the peak. But the shift from, I'm going to go substantially later on my trip, that is something that this model, because each of the trips are independent. So what we can't say is, if I show up late to work, can I also leave early to avoid the PM congestion charge, which takes place at 3 p.m.? Well, not every day, right? Maybe if I show up late, I also have to leave later. So this is where the activity-based modeling approach shows some promise, although even in that platform, it has a lot of challenges really capturing that behavior well. So the practices that I've seen, and this is certainly something that's worth looking closer at, is essentially you kind of do an off-model process. You say, here's the distribution of trips. We can operate with that same distribution, right? So we can kind of see, okay, conservatively, saying no one changes their time of day, they only change mode or destination. How much congestion reduction could we expect with this level toll and this coordinate definition? But then we could also say, well, let's assume that X% of work trips will shift from the AM peak to the midday. And we can apply that and again see what is the shift in mode, destination, and in the congestion levels. But the model is not just going to tell us that. In some ways, that's not a bad thing because it's a model, right? We have these assumptions. How do people in the Boston region respond to a coordinate toll? We don't know, but we can make these assumptions and we can test it with the model and get some insights into how different strategies will respond.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Len.
David Kosas.
Okay, thank you, Marty. There's a lot here to absorb. So I'll just ask a question on congestion pricing through a coordinate line. And there's a lot of different questions we could ask, but for this one, I agree that the model doesn't, we're not asking how much you're willing to pay to save time. So I'm wondering, do we have the ability in the model to figure out in certain areas, right, where we know that there are good, viable alternative routes that someone could choose to use. So, so that if there's a motorist that's traveling along, I-90 or 93, and where we're thinking about adding an additional toll, that motorist would face, the choice of either paying the toll or deciding that, hey, we all know that this is a really good alternative route that we could take that would bring me through the local streets, right, through the city or town. So I guess, in certain cases, do we have the ability to highlight these, implications for cities and towns? If we were to add an additional toll somewhere, what does that mean? Where would, what would the impact be to these communities?
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, that's certainly one of the things that this model can be very useful for. And so what it sounds to me is like you're interested in that assignment step. So answering the question of what routes do you take in response to an additional toll on a facility, right? And what might be your default shortest path, but now we're going to toll it. So time and cost together, you're open to other ways. So the model can certainly help us see, how does the volume that the trips that we're going to use 90 and they start moving into maybe some of the local streets. And then there are trips on the local streets. Where do they go? How do they get displaced? And so this modeling platform, and it becomes an enormously complex problem to think about, right? But the model can really be a useful way to show that sort of the rerouting and the displacement of other trips. And then we can also take a bigger picture and be like, okay, what is now our picture of delay in focused areas to get more insight into the impact of these displaced trips from the major expressway. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. And I think it's exactly the same kind of thing when you're talking about the price of parking somewhere, because it makes all the difference in the world if there is an alternative free place to park, and I think in many parts of our region, there's ample free parking all over the place, except maybe in Cambridge, parts of Boston, wherever you need to have a permit. Everywhere else, it doesn't seem to make any difference what we charge if there's a free parking space on a street, 1 minute walk away, that will always be used immediately, right? So
yeah, that's a
so
great.
I think we're talking about like using the model, zooming into certain areas where we know that the issues would be make a difference.
Yes, and I think you make a really good point about the ample free parking, either on the street or other kind of lots, where we want to try pricing to move people to other modes, to non-auto modes. The model just believes what we tell it. So the model doesn't, if we say to the model, in this zone, it's going to cost you $40 a day to park. That's what it is. And the model doesn't know, like, oh, there's these side streets that if you can just go and put your car there. So that's where there's that extra work outside of the model to set up those inputs to capture that. And so absolutely, like, we're going to have to be careful in this representation to not overstate the potential efficacy of these strategies.
Okay, good. Thank you, Marty.
Yeah,
Jen Rowe.
Hi, thank you. First, Tegan and Marty, this was the most clear explanation of a travel demand model I've heard, and I really hard to come by, and I appreciate it. My question, I saw that one of the questions the model would be able to answer was, what portion of trips by home tags would be most impacted in the case of an equity analysis. And my question is what degree is it capable of breaking down those impacts further by income, race, other demographic characteristics? Because I imagine there might be some TASs where you'd see a negative impact, like lower income community further from the core. But when you looked further at, broke that down by population, and you might see a different picture emerge. So just curious what level of disaggregation there could be done.
So because we're going to be working at the TAZ level, so what's challenging is if there's a lot of mix of households within a TAZ. If we have, some portion of what would be equity households, but a large portion of non-equity households. Once we step beyond how many trips are coming out of your household, we kind of lose that definition of this is a trip from an equity household that's going, to this location downtown that would then pay the toll versus the non-equity household next door. So part of it is going to be constrained at how we have abstracted with the zones, but we can look at, kind of the picture, and this is how we do our equity analysis now. It's essentially like we've defined certain zones as having an equity population. Let's pay attention to the trips from those zones, knowing that they're not all from that, but at least we get a bit more information. So actually saying that, one of the things that I'm really excited to test with our new modeling platform, because we're working with now fully disaggregate household data and person data. The MAPC has adopted an urban sim representation for the socioeconomic forecasts. So that gives us for each zone a table, a list of the households, and people. So we have a ton of information. And one of the things we're going to experiment with is actually running subsets of that. So we actually can get even more information. We can get where are those equity households traveling to, what modes are they using. So this is something that's a little bit more in the research range, and I want to do some more testing around. But I think there's definitely some potential there that we can answer questions like, how many, if you put a toll on, a certain facility or a cordon area, how many equity households, what portion of them will be trying to cross that or have to find a different destination or have to change mode in order to, to avoid that toll. So I think we can get, some good insights into those impacts.
Thank you, Marty. Bill Conroy. Oh, Bill, you're muted.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you, Marty. As David said, a lot to digest here. It felt like I was in a Cal 3 course in the morning at 8 o'clock in the morning. And I got lost like in the first 3 slides, That being said, I commend you and the staff there. You're like that smart guy. I keep asking people in big meetings, like, where is that smart guy? I guess you are that smart guy, And that being said, I think this model, and I just relate this back to when we built the central artery and used transplant and all that for the analysis and went on for years. But now, I can see this being applied to mega projects like, for lane use and managed lane use, BRT, future, present day. How soon do you think we would be able to use this model and probably integrate it, as you said, to another model to help us with design of those major infrastructure projects? So as they relate to, say I-90, that project, I know there's been a ton of analysis, done on that as well. But, and to Dave's question too, people jumping off I-90 to avoid tolls, this and that. So there's just so much here. And I guess there's no, silver bullet that's going to fix everything. But I guess where I'm headed is that, how soon would I be able to get my hands on something like this, or we would be able to use present day? And would it give us that time in the future where, yeah, well, you got 4 lanes today, you need 4 lanes, but yet, 10 years from now, you're only going to need 3. And then after that, you're only going to need X, and how's that? And I guess it's a question I'm asking the professor, and you're like the professor. So, so that's my question. Good.
I have to compliment you. It's a good strategy to flatter as you ask our very hard questions. Well done there. So what I'm describing is I definitely have kind of sprinkled through this presentation a lot of the new features of the model that we're developing. that is we're developing for the next LRTP. We're hoping to have something, mid next year that could be used even for application. So right now we're in our development phase. We're going to be heading into calibrating it. But the point of you're asking, I think you're really getting at that key question of like, will this model answer our questions? It will not answer all your questions, right? It can certainly give you a lot of insights. This model is very useful, and models like it, including the one we have, it can be very useful for saying, what is the flow of travel demand, right? What are the trips that are trying to go through, the major corridor by all modes that would use I-90, that could use I-90, that could benefit from that? And then what's the relationship between different socioeconomic forecasts and that travel demand, right? Because there's uncertainty in that area as well. So and we could even, turn the question around. You're saying, 3 lanes or 2 lanes. We could say, what would it take to reduce the demand such that it's within 2 lanes? What are the different land use scenarios? We can try different toll strategies, right? And see how much shift we can get from each piece. And then that gives us a lot of good insight into, the potential. And also will highlight, I think, different kind of challenge areas.
So Marty, we are like running out of time right now. And Daniel, we're going to hold on your question because we do have the MPO meeting starting in like a minute or so. I think it would be worth maybe having Marty come back for another one, like at our next meeting, and we could have a further discussion about this. So I'm going to propose that, and staff can try to put that on the agenda. So I'm going to move just to are there any members items right now? I'm not seeing any. Sandy, when is our next meeting?
So we don't currently have one on the calendar. I am actually going to throw in the chat real quick before we all have to go to the FPL meeting, the updated UPWP development page. I've been in conversation with OTP about the development schedule for the next UPWP, and actually it's going to be a little bit more relaxed than it has been in past years. So I'll be in touch with folks about when the next meeting is going to be. It probably won't be until at least January. And possibly even February. And we can definitely, I can work with the chair to bring back Marty to talk about these issues more at that meeting.
Okay, that sounds great. Okay, can I have a motion to adjourn?
Eric Schuster, motion to adjourn. Second.
Great. So can I have a second?
Second.
Great. Then without objection, we are adjourned, and I will see you all at the MPO meeting in a couple of minutes. Thanks, Marty. Thanks all.